While I'm wildly excited about someone as talented as Christopher Nolan bringing it to the big screen and taking the source material seriously, he's not quite right when he says that it contains all stories. Imagine a conflict where both sides are right and neither can win without destroying the other. Now ask why we almost never tell that story.
Inconceivable!
We all know the idea of a fight between good and evil. It's the operating system of our storytelling, from Eden's snake to Voldemort's nose, and it shapes how we view world events. Take the Israel-Palestine conflict. Many people have very strong views on it, and what they're agreed on is that it's a conflict between good and evil. The only thing they're not agreed on is who the good guys and who the bad guys are. According to someone like Douglas Murray, whose book with the unsubtle title of On Democracies and Death Cults, Israel and the Future of Civilization, I read last week, this is absolutely a fight between good and evil. Between civilization, democracy, and an affirmation of the value of human life on the one side, that is Israel's side, and barbarism, anti-Semitism, and a death cult on the other, the anti-Israeli side. For Murray, the line is bright and sharp. If you can't see it, you're either morally blind or intellectually dishonest. But according to many other people around the world, what's happening in Palestine-Israel is also a clear fight between good and evil, except it's Israel that plays the role of the villain. I live in what's historically been the most rural and backwater spot of Ireland, County Donegal. But even here, it's not uncommon to see the green and yellow Donegal flags for the Gaelic football team flying alongside the black, green, red and white of a Palestinian flag. Free Palestine, Gaza, genocide, and other graffiti adorn walls and street signs. The prevailing view here is that Israel represents settler colonialism, a foreign imposition by powerful people using the tools of empire against the native Palestinians. In that frame, even the bloodiest and most butchersome acts of resistance are seen not as intrinsic evils, but as the unfortunate consequences of oppression, as the predictable, even inevitable, result of colonial injustice. So what do we do with these two narratives that both see a conflict between good and evil, yet arrive at diametrically opposed conclusions about who the bad guys are? Is one side simply deluded? Are they being manipulated by propaganda? Are they morally confused or just plain wrong?
That would be inconceivable.
To approach an answer to that, I want to look at something that's largely missing from our narrative toolkit, something we've gotten very bad at telling, namely a certain kind of tragedy. Not the tragedy of evil winning against good, nor of a good man brought down by a fatal flaw, but the tragedy of good versus good, of two noble visions coming into conflict, not because one is evil, but because they are in some fundamental way irreconcilable. This isn't to deny that people in such conflicts can commit atrocities or can have bad ideologies. They do. Families are driven from their homes, children are left to die or are outright murdered. Corruption, hatred, revenge, lies. And those things can and should be named for what they are. But the underlying conflict, what gives it such enduring, bone-gnawing power, is not a war between light and darkness. It's a collision between two deeply held goods. And often it's precisely the failure to recognize this, to recognize the legitimate good on the opposing side, that leads to so many of these terrible things. I've tried to think of examples in our stories where that sort of tragedy is at the centre, and frankly, they're few and far between. One that's come to mind is Antigone, Sophocles' play about a young woman who defies the king's orders to honor a higher moral law by burying her brother, setting up a tragic clash between individual conscience and state authority. Here, both Antigone, the woman, and Creon, the king, are right in different registers. Antigone honors the unwritten divine law of familial piety and the dead. Creon upholds the civic law and the fragile order of the state. Both are noble, both are necessary. And yet, in their clash, tragedy unfolds. There is no villain, only competing goods that cannot coexist. The result is ruin. But even Antigone, noteworthy as it is, inhabits this kind of good versus good tragedy, mostly on a personal or interpersonal scale. What I'm after is rarer still, a large-scale civilizational story of competing goods. Perhaps the strongest candidate for that kind of storytelling is another ancient Greek, Homer. And at first I thought, yes, isn't the Iliad a civilizational good versus good story like that? Because, I mean, Homer doesn't present the Trojans as villains. Quite the opposite. Hector's the most sympathetic, honourable and tragic figure in the whole poem. He fights for his family, for his city, and even knowing he will lose, he accepts his fate with a dignity that sometimes eclipses the rage of Achilles. That's already an ethical complication. You're not supposed to weep for the bad guys. Also, both sides are driven by values that aren't easily dismissed. Achilles, Agamemnon, Hector, Priam, they're all caught in a web of honor, loyalty, and cosmic order. No one is evil. Even Achilles' rage, brutal as it is humanized by grief and love for Patroclus. And Priam's visit to Achilles' tent, two grieving men on opposite sides, may be one of the most moving good versus good moments in all of ancient literature. Okay, so far so good. But then I thought about it some more and realized, actually there's no tragic irreconcilability of goals or values. The core value, kleos, glory, legacy, is shared by both sides. That's not pluralism, that's competition within a shared moral universe. The war is horrifying, but it fulfills the same telos for both Greeks and Trojans, to become immortal in song. Death isn't the ultimate tragedy, obscurity is. And so even loss becomes a kind of fulfillment. Hector dies and is remembered forever. Achilles dies and becomes myth. The Iliad is a story where everyone pretty much gets what they were aiming for. The deaths are tragic, but they're not tragic because good clashed with good and tore the moral universe apart. They're tragic in a different register because mortality is the cost of eternal name. And the Odyssey is even less of a good versus good story. While I'm wildly excited about someone as talented as Christopher Nolan bringing it to the big screen and taking the source material seriously, he's not quite right when he says that it contains all stories. Yes, the Odyssey is romance, tragedy, adventure, horror, mystery and more. But it's not a good versus good story. The suitors, for example, aren't given the kind of moral dignity that Hector receives. And when Odysseus, spoiler alert, slaughters them, it's brutal, but not tragic in the same sense.
Promise me you will come back.
What if I can't?
The very difficulty in naming such a story might itself say something about the moral architecture of our culture. We tend to crave clarity, especially in grand narratives, even when we recognize that both sides may have grievances. We often arrange stories such that one emerges as the true victim or the ultimate wrongdoer. Popular stories in particular, with their tendency towards moral catharsis and their commercial dependence on audience identification, rarely gamble on the messiness of equal legitimacy in conflict.
Are we enemies? Why am I on this wall? Where's Buttercup? Let me explain. No, there is too much. Let me sum up.
A story that does gamble with this messiness is the sci-fi novel Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky, which held me in its web, appropriately enough. In it, the remnants of humanity flee a dying Earth and encounter a planet where giant, intelligent spiders have built a civilization, leading to an epic confrontation, an uneasy reckoning between two dominant species, each in need of a planet with no other suitable place around. The story hovers on the brink of a good versus good narrative before, spoiler alert, retreating into the reassuring glow of reconciliation. What initially feels like a genuine clash of survival imperatives is ultimately resolved not through the intractability of tragic conflict, but by collapsing the dilemma into mutual understanding. Because the conflict turned out to be just a misunderstanding, really. It wasn't actually a conflict of two irreconcilable goods, as there was plenty of room for both species on the same planet. A beautiful ending, to be sure, but one that confirms my broader point, that even when fiction flirts with the tragic, it often pulls back. The structural gravitational force of narrative tends to steer away from irresolvable conflict and towards either synthesis or defeat.
Get used to disappointment.